June 22nd, 1941. Moscow awoke under an ordinary summer sun, the kind that normally promises warmth and calm. Yet an unseen storm had already begun to sweep across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. In a modest office within the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin sat hunched over his desk, a sheaf of reports spread before him. His eyes, usually sharp and unreadable, betrayed a rare flicker of tension as he read the morning dispatches. The distant roar of artillery, though, filtered through. Layers of bureaucracy and delays beginning to pierce the carefully constructed barrier between the Soviet capital and the approaching nightmare. For months, warnings had been filtered up through channels that were too slow, too cautious, or too afraid of contradicting the party line. The intelligence was grim. German divisions, hundreds of thousands strong, had already crossed the border, advancing with lightning speed through the Baltic states and into Belarus. Yet in this very room, Stalin faced a profound paradox. The man who had meticulously crafted an image of unshakable strength now grappled with raw uncertainty. His aides hovered in the shadows, reluctant to speak too boldly, too urgently. Stalin's personal moment, rarely glimpsed by those outside his inner circle, was the human core of a global catastrophe about to unfold. He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and stared at a map where red lines were already being swallowed by the grey tide of the Wehrmacht. Every inch of territory lost would not just be a military setback. It would ripple through Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and beyond, threatening the survival of millions and the very heart of the Soviet state. The invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had been planned with brutal precision. 3 army groups, north, center, and south, were driving relentlessly, aiming not just to occupy land, but to annihilate the Red Army before it could mount an effective defense. By the time reports reached Stalin, entire Soviet units had already been encircled and destroyed. Yet Stalin did not summon a public panic. He sat in silence, the weight of an empire pressing down on him, weighing his next words with the gravity of history. In these hours, Stalin's mind raced between disbelief, calculation, and the visceral reality of a nation under sudden, violent assault. He understood the stakes, not only in military terms, but in human cost. The soldiers who would face the German blitzhead, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the ideological fortress of socialism that could crumble under rapid invasion. The personal was inseparable from the political, the human cost inseparable from the survival of the state. By mid-morning, the first voice broke the silencer, cautious aide reporting fragmented news from the front. Stalin listened, expression unchanged, yet his mind was already moving, dissecting scenarios, weighing countermeasures, and contemplating the unthinkable. The USSR, caught off guard, might suffer catastrophic losses in the opening weeks. Outside, the streets of Moscow continued in a fragile normalcy. But within the walls of the Kremlin, history was being recalibrated with every tick of the clock. The day had begun with the ordinary rituals of governance. By nightfall, it would mark the opening chapter of a war that would engulf millions, redefine alliances, and test the limits of human endurance. Stalin, seated in that quiet office, was about to make decisions that would echo across the Eastern Front, shaping the fate of the Soviet Union in ways that no report or map could fully convey. By the afternoon of June 22nd, 1941, the full scale of the German assault had begun to crystallize. Reports arrived with a chilling cadence. Entire Soviet border outposts obliterated, armored divisions smashed, communication lines severed, The initial disbelief that had clung to Stalin since dawn was now giving way to a grim calculation. He was no stranger to crisis, yet this was different. This was not an internal purge or political intrigue. This was a war that threatened the very survival of the Soviet state. In the Kremlin, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. Stalin moved deliberately, consulting maps, cross-referencing intelligence, and summoning his closest military advisors. The generals arrived, some pale, some stiff with formality, all acutely aware of the stakes. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the newly appointed commander of the Western Front, delivered a report. German forces had already penetrated deeply into Belarus, encircling Soviet units in what would soon be recognized as the first massive blow of Operation Barbarossa. The words were clinical, but the reality behind them was devastating. Stalin's response was measured, yet resolute. He ordered that Soviet forces avoid unnecessary retreats, but emphasized the need to regroup and establish defensive lines wherever possible. He recognized that his own previous skepticism of intelligence, reports his mistrust of alarmist warnings had cost precious time. Now there was no room for error. Every decision would reverberate across thousands of kilometers of territory and countless lives. Meanwhile, ordinary Soviet citizens were beginning to grasp the enormity of the invasion. In Minsk, trains packed with refugees raced eastward, carrying families who had hours before lived normal, if tense, lives. Cities near the front were plunged into chaos. Artillery fire shattered the morning calm, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and fear. Across the Western Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg was transforming the landscape into a corridor of destruction. Stalin, seated in his office thousands of kilometers away, understood that these human tragedies were now inseparable from his strategic calculations in private moments. Stalin was not just the architect of Soviet strategy. He was also a man confronting the fragility of human life on an unprecedented scale. Reports of encircled units, of towns razed, of civilians caught in crossfire, passed over his desk. His expression remained stoic, but beneath the surface, a turbulent mix of anger, grief, and cold determination simmered. He knew that leadership demanded not only decisions, but a moral reckoning with consequences that could never be fully controlled. As evening approached, Stalin addressed his inner circle, emphasizing the necessity of immediate mobilization. He insisted that every resource troops, tanks, aircraft be directed to halting the German advance. Yet, even as orders were issued and plans drafted, the enormity of the situation weighed heavily. Entire regions could be lost. Millions could be displaced or killed, and the Soviet Union itself could be shattered if missteps were made. The human and political stakes were inseparable, entwined in a war that would define the fate of a continent. The first day of the German invasion closed not with victory or defeat, but with an agonizing uncertainty. Stalin, in his office, remained a solitary figure surrounded by maps and reports, acutely aware that every choice, every command, could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. The war had begun, and with it a series of decisions that would test not only the strength of the Soviet military, but the endurance of its people under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. June 23, 1941. Moscow woke to a sky streaked with smoke from distant fires along the Western Front. Overnight, the Wehrmacht had pressed deeper into Soviet territory, their armored columns slicing through Belarus and western Ukraine with terrifying speed. Stalin convened a morning briefing in the Kremlin, the air thick with tension, the weight of impending catastrophe pressing down on every word spoken. This was no ordinary day of war. It was the first true test of the Soviet Union's resilience against an enemy whose ferocity had been underestimated at the highest levels. In the dimly lit room, maps covered every surface. Stalin moved slowly along the table, his eyes scanning red lines that marked Soviet defensive positions now under assault. Marshal Zhukov, recently reassigned from the Far East, presented updated intelligence. Entire divisions had been encircled, and communications with frontline commanders were patchy at best. Stalin listened intently, his mind dissecting the data. There was no panic in his demeanor, only the relentless calculation of a man who understood that the very survival of his state demanded clarity, decisiveness, and ruthlessness. The human cost was mounting by the hour. Reports filtered in of villages burned, civilians fleeing in terror, and soldiers trapped in the deadly embrace of blitzkrieg tactics. Stalin knew these were not just statistics, they were individuals, families, entire communities whose fates now rested in part on his decisions. The paradox of leadership in such moments was stark. Empathy and ruthlessness coexisted uneasily, and the line between strategic necessity and human suffering blurred with every passing hour. By midday, Stalin issued orders for partial counterattacks designed to slow the German advance, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Yet he was acutely aware that the Red Army, caught unprepared and in disarray, could not immediately match the precision and speed of the Wehrmacht. He instructed regional commanders to prioritize the evacuation of civilians from threatened areas, while simultaneously reinforcing industrial centers critical to the war effort. Every directive reflected the dual nature of his responsibility: protect the state, and, as much as possible, shield the people whose lives it encompassed. Outside the Kremlin, the city of Moscow was still calm, a deceptive tranquility masking the chaos to the west. Yet the mood among Stalin's closest advisors was tense. Fear, frustration, and urgency mingled in the room as decisions were debated, challenged, and ultimately acted upon. Stalin, known for his steely control, allowed moments of input but made it clear that the final word was his alone. Every hesitation, every miscalculation could cost thousands of lives and endanger the Soviet Union itself. As evening descended, Stalin returned to his private quarters for a brief moment of solitude. The enormity of the invasion pressed against him like a physical weight. Yet in that quiet, there was also a steely resolve. The Soviet Union would not simply be swept aside. The coming weeks would be brutal, defined by desperate defensive actions, heroic sacrifices, and decisions that would shape the trajectory of the war and the very essence of Stalin's leadership. He understood with absolute clarity that the path ahead was fraught with unimaginable trials, but he would meet them with the cold, unyielding precision that history would remember. June 24, 1941. The third day of the German invasion dawned with grim clarity. Operation Barbarossa was not a fleeting strike, but a relentless surge, each hour pushing deeper into Soviet territory. In the Kremlin, Stalin sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of maps, telegrams, and intelligence reports. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but the weight of a nation's fate rested visibly on his shoulders. Outside, the streets of Moscow carried on with routine traffic and chatter, a fragile veneer of normalcy over a country already at war. Reports from the front painted a grim, almost cinematic scene. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded in the forests and swamps of Belarus. Artillery barrages had reduced towns to rubble, while terrified civilians fled eastward in long columns, carrying whatever they could salvage. Stalin's advisors warned that morale among both troops and civilians was fragile. Panic could spread faster than the enemy's tanks. Stalin listened without interruption, his mind moving through every possible scenario, calculating how to contain the chaos and stabilize the front dot in the command room. A quiet tension prevailed as Stalin directed the allocation of reserves. He understood that some losses were unavoidable, yet he sought to create pockets of resistance that could buy precious time for Moscow and Leningrad. Orders went out for counterattacks near key strategic points, even as he recognized that the Red Army was still disorganized and unprepared for the speed and coordination of the German advance. Stalin's approach was meticulous. Every deployment, every defensive position, every withdrawal was weighed not just in military terms, but in the human lives they would impact. By midday, news arrived of a rapidly collapsing sector in western Ukraine. Civilian reports described entire villages engulfed in flames, schools and churches abandoned, families scattered. Stalin read the messages with a steady gaze, understanding that the suffering of ordinary people was inseparable from the strategic calculations of a war that had already claimed thousands of lives. His mind, however, remained fixed on survival and ultimate victory. The dual imperatives of preserving both the state and its capacity to fight. Evening brought a rare moment of reflection. Stalin, alone in his office, traced the paths of the German advance across the maps, noting both successes and potential vulnerabilities. He considered what the Soviet Union had underestimated: the speed, coordination, and sheer audacity of Hitler's offensive. Yet within this recognition, he also saw opportunity. Delaying actions, scorched earth strategies, and the mobilization of every available resource could blunt the Wehrmacht's momentum. In those quiet hours, he began formulating the decisions that would define the next critical phase of the conflict, aware that each choice carried consequences that could extend far beyond the battlefield. The fourth day of the invasion closed with Moscow still intact, yet the shadow of catastrophe had deepened. Stalin's gaze lingered on the maps as night fell, the distant sounds of artillery a grim reminder that the war was no longer a distant threat but an immediate, brutal reality. In this moment, the Soviet leader was both strategist and witness, caught between the human cost of the unfolding tragedy and the imperatives of leadership that would shape the course of history. June 25, 1941. The fifth day of the German invasion began under a sky heavy with smoke and dust, stretching across forests, fields, and towns already scarred by the Blitzkrieg. In the Kremlin, Stalin convened an early morning council with his senior military commanders. The mood was tense, a mixture of urgency and grim resolve. Reports indicated that German panzer divisions had reached the Dnieper, splitting Soviet forces and threatening to sever critical supply lines. Every map on the table was marked with red and grey, a visual testament to both the speed of the enemy and the precariousness of Soviet defense. Stalin listened in silence as generals outlined losses, encircled divisions, shattered communication networks, and collapsing defensive positions. Each report carried not only strategic weight but also human tragedy. Stalin's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the details, weighing the implications for both the front lines and the cities far to the east. While the German advance was devastating, he saw gaps in coordination, overextended supply lines, vulnerabilities that could be exploited if acted upon decisively. In private moments, Stalin's mind returned repeatedly to the civilians caught in the maelstrom. Refugee columns stretched for miles, families crammed onto trains heading east, and countless individuals were stranded, terrified, and exposed. Stalin recognized the moral and political stakes. The resilience of the Soviet people was as critical to survival as the strength of its army. Every directive he issued carried the dual mandate of slowing the enemy while safeguarding the population as much as possible under impossible circumstances. By afternoon, Stalin took the extraordinary step of communicating directly with frontline commanders, bypassing bureaucratic layers that had already proven fatal in the first days. He instructed immediate counteroffensives in select sectors, aiming not for decisive victory but for strategic delay. At the same time, he authorized scorched earth policies, factories dismantled, crops burned, infrastructure destroyed to deny resources to the advancing Germans. It was a harsh calculus, one that placed the long-term survival of the nation above immediate comfort or convenience, and one that foreshadowed the ruthless decisions that would characterize the war on the Eastern Front. Evening brought further reports. Pockets of resistance had slowed the German advance in certain areas, buying crucial time for the Red Army to regroup. Yet losses were mounting, and the psychological toll on both soldiers and civilians was becoming apparent. Stalin, seated in the quiet of his office, reviewed maps once more, tracing the paths of his directives with meticulous attention. He was aware that every choice, every order, could mean the difference between life and death, not just for military personnel, but for the millions who called the Soviet Union home as night fell. Stalin remained at his desk, the dim light casting long shadows across the maps. The fifth day of the invasion had revealed both the ferocity of the enemy and the fragility of the Soviet response. But it had also revealed a critical truth. Leadership in such moments demanded a blend of ruthless pragmatism, strategic foresight, and an unshakable will. Stalin's decisions over the next days would determine not just immediate survival, but the character and endurance of a nation under siege. July 3, 1941, 11 days after the German invasion began, the Soviet Union finally heard Stalin's voice. Until that moment, silence had filled the vacuum silence that bred rumors, fear, and disbelief. Now, radios across Moscow, Leningrad, and the farthest villages crackled to life as citizens paused, held their breath, and listened. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa erupted, Stalin spoke directly to the people he ruled. He did not begin as a triumphant leader. He began as a man confronting disaster. "Comrades," he said, "citizens of the Soviet Union." The words were deliberate, measured. He acknowledged what everyone already knew but few had heard confirmed from the highest authority. The Red Army had suffered grave losses. Entire regions were occupied. Cities had fallen. The enemy was deep inside Soviet territory. This admission alone marked a turning point. Stalin, long known for projecting absolute certainty, now framed the war not as a temporary setback, but as a brutal, existential struggle inside the Kremlin. Those who had worked beside him sensed the shift. Stalin was no longer speaking only as General Secretary or Supreme Commander. He was crafting a narrative that would define the war in moral and emotional terms. He named the invasion for what it was, not merely a conflict between states, but a great patriotic war. With that phrase, he transformed fear into purpose, survival into duty. The war was no longer about borders or ideology alone. It was about homes, families, and the right to exist. Stalin's words carried a stark realism. He warned that the struggle would be long and merciless. There would be no easy victories, No quick resolutions. Factories would have to move east. Civilians would have to endure deprivation. Soldiers would have to fight with everything they had, often with nothing but their will. Yet woven into the gravity was a calculated resolve. He invoked history in Napoleon's failed invasion, Russia's capacity to absorb punishment and strike back. The message was clear. The Soviet Union could bend, but it would not break. Across the country, the impact was immediate. In cramped apartments, in rural villages, on factory floors, people listened in silence. Some wept, others clenched their fists. Stalin's voice did not erase fear, but it gave fear direction. The war now had meaning beyond chaos. For soldiers already retreating under relentless pressure, the speech became a psychological anchor. For civilians facing occupation or evacuation, it framed suffering as sacrifice rather than abandonment. When the broadcast ended, Stalin remained in the Kremlin, surrounded once again by maps and reports. The German advance had not stopped. Kiev was threatened. Smolensk loomed as the next great battlefield. Nothing in material terms had improved. Yet something intangible had shifted. Stalin had spoken and, in doing so, he had bound his fate to that of the nation in the most public way possible. If the Soviet Union survived, he would survive with it. If it fell, history would remember his words as a final stand against annihilation. Outside, the war raged on, indifferent to speeches and symbols. But from that moment forward, the conflict was no longer defined solely by what Hitler had unleashed. It was now shaped by how the Soviet Union, its soldiers, its civilians, and its leader chose to endure, resist, and ultimately respond.